The Great Depression was a worldwide economic downturn that began in 1929 and lasted until about 1939. It was the longest and most severe depression ever experienced by the industrialised Western world, sparking fundamental changes in economic institutions. President Hoover had a bad reputation as the Great Depression began, since his lazy approach to economics didn't help relieve the situation. He assumed the crash and the depression would be over quickly and that government interference was unnecessary. The depression had psychologically devastated the nation as Roosevelt took the oath of office at noon on March 4, 1933. All state governors had authorised bank holidays or restricted withdrawals, as many Americans had little or no access to their bank accounts. From 1929 to 1933, manufacturing output decreased by 1/3, which economist Milton Friedman called the Great Contraction. Prices fell by 20%, causing deflation that made repaying debts much harder. Unemployment in the United States increased from 4% to 25%. Franklin Roosevelt, a 1932 presidential candidate, gives his New Deal speech to the public to reveal his plans for economic recovery. In one of the key events of the Great Depression timeline, Democratic candidate Franklin Roosevelt is elected President of the United States after defeating Herbert Hoover in a landslide victory. President Roosevelt begins his first 100 days in office, and 15 laws are introduced rapidly to begin tackling the Great Depression. Just 5 days after his inauguration, President Roosevelt creates the Emergency Banking Act, launching the New Deal. In order to prevent more terrible failures, the Act closed all banks in the United States. Much of the New Deal legislation was enacted within the first 3 months of Roosevelt's presidency, which was March 9 to June 16, 1933, which became known as the 100 Days. The new administration's first objective was to alleviate the suffering of the nation's huge number of unemployed workers. The New Deal was a massive effort to lift the United States out of the Great Depression on several fronts. President Roosevelt's plan created the Social Security Administration to protect older Americans financially and used the Agricultural Adjustment Act to help farmers get out of debt. The New Deal included new constraints and safeguards on the banking industry and efforts to reinflate the economy after prices had fallen sharply. New Deal relief programs were used not just to hire the unemployed, but also to build needed schools, municipal buildings, waterworks, sewers, streets and parks according to local specifications. Such agencies as the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, were established to dispense emergency and short-term governmental aid and to provide temporary jobs, unemployment on construction projects and youth work in the national forests. The WPA gave some 8.5 million people jobs. Its construction projects produced more than 650,000 miles of roads, 125,000 public buildings, 75,000 bridges and 8,000 parks. The CCC provided national conservation work primarily for young unmarried men. Projects included planting trees, building flood barriers, fighting forest fires, and maintaining forest roads and trails. As the Great Depression dragged on, workers grew more militant. In December 1936, for example, the United Auto Workers strike at a GM plant in Flint, Michigan, lasted for 44 days and spread to some 150,000 auto workers in 35 cities around the country. Historically, striking workers had risked their lives on the picket lines, though unions often formed in response to dangerous working conditions. Going on strike exposed workers to the danger of physical violence from hired thugs or police that served as company strong arms. GM had the law on their side, but they risked public humiliation and legal consequences of their own if they used physical force to evict the workers. Instead, 13 days after the strike began, GM cut off the heat in 16-degree weather. When workers went outside to complain, security guards and police rushed in. As tear gas filled the plant, workers fought back, throwing everything from automobile bolts to pieces of roof iron at the attackers before the police finally fled. Workers dubbed the melee the Battle of the Running Bulls. The US recovery began in the spring of 1933. Output grew rapidly in the mid-1930s. Real GDP rose at an average rate of 9% per year between 1933 and 1937. Output had fallen so deeply in the early years of the 1930s. Recovery in the United States was stopped short by another distinct recession that began in May 1937. Recession was a decision by the Federal Reserve to greatly increase reserve requirements. By 1939, the New Deal had run its course. In the short term, the New Deal programs helped improve the lives of people suffering from the events of the Depression. In the long run, New Deal programs set a precedent for the federal government to play a key role in the economic and social affairs of the nation. By 1941, real GDP in the United States had recovered to within about 10% of its long-run trend path. Therefore, the United States had largely recovered from the Great Depression even before World War II related military spending accelerated.